start in lieu of Dave. He's on the way.
He's on his way.
Just a little bit behind schedule. All right. Hopefully you're here for the Gospels, right?
Yeah.
No, we're here because of the gospel.
All right. Well, get up here and tell us about that. I like that. Let me pray and then we'll get started. Father, we love you. We're here because we love your word, and Jesus excites us, and what he's done for us amazes us, and we want to know him better, know you better, and just be changed as we interact with you through your word. Just pray your blessing on our time. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. This is always a good opportunity for me to pitch good study Bibles. If you guys have ever taken me in Bible Institute, you know I pitch study Bibles. I think everybody should own a study Bible. If you don't, and you own a power tool, you should get a study Bible. It's the power tool of Bible study, right? Good study Bibles. I like to promote the MacArthur Study Bible because I think John MacArthur most exemplifies an agreement with where Countryside is theologically. You would say in both our essentials and our distinctives, we would line up on a lot of things. But there are three other excellent study Bibles that I like to promote. One that has just fantastic notes. And you guys are like, oh, are you serious? The NLT Study Bible. I mean, you're like, the New Living Translation. Well, it's not the Living Bible that you remember, right? That was Ken Taylor took the King James Version, tried to explain it to his children. So he wrote it out simply. That became the Living Bible. The success of the Living Bible led to the NLT, but this is a legitimate translation with committee. Not a one-man deal. There was a committee. The notes are actually excellent, different from the Life Application Study Bible. I highly recommend this as a second Bible to the MacArthur Study Bible because it's always good to read in a different translation. Helps you understand and see things, from a different point of view. What is in here is tried and tested. All four of these are tried and tested. This is like, while the internet is very suspicious, all the information out there, these are like peer-reviewed journals. These things have gone through rigorous scholarship and testing of time, and they have shown themselves to be excellent. The third one that I would recommend then, and some people say, why is that the third one? That's the one you bought your kids. Well, it's the ESV Study Bible. It's got just some incredible articles in the back of it. And all of these introductions, all the things that I'm sharing, that's Brian's probably, a lot of things that Brian has probably shared are in a lot of the book introductions to these study Bibles. And the last is the NIV Biblical Theology Study Bible. It used to be known as the NIV Zondervan Study Bible, not to be confused with the NIV Study Bible. Did you guys catch all that? This study Bible is a fairly new study Bible. D.A. Carson, an eminent New Testament scholar, was the general editor of this study Bible. Its notes are excellent. It's an excellent Bible. My very first study Bible was the NIV Study Bible, and if you have one of those, it is still an excellent study Bible. The new edition is not quite as good in the notes as like the 1984 edition, but you can't go wrong with a study Bible. Just never bring your study Bible to church, right? Because it's distracting. And you spend too much time reading the notes and not enough time listening to what God is trying to say through preaching, which is the way he has designed the church to transmit information on Sunday. And then lastly, I got a new copy of this because my other copy is fairly worn. I really like Fee and Stewart's How to Read the Bible Book by Book, not to be confused with their hermeneutics book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, but book by book. In the time allotted, there's no way to even go through all of the recommendations they give for reading each of the Gospels. They do a lot of more detailed work, pointing you in various sections to things to look for as you read the Bible. I think the way we are reading the Bible is one that they would highly support. But sometimes you want to just do it differently, and they can help you really zero in. Say you read the same book for 30 days, right? You're going to read that over and over and over and really look for the things that they are asking you to look for. Fee and Stewart, we're not going to agree with everything that they believe or teach theologically, but they're excellent scholars and they've done good work. All right, the Gospels. Mitch Maher of Clarifying the Bible fame, he likes to say the Old Testament is summed up in the word anticipation, and then the New Testament is summed up in these 4 words: manifestation, proclamation, explanation, and consummation. Manifestation being his word for the Gospels, the 4 Gospels. The Old Testament anticipated the coming of Messiah. The Gospels are the manifestation of Messiah. Proclamation being the book of Acts, right? As the gospel is proclaimed throughout the world. And then explanation would be the epistles of Paul and the general epistles, the epistles of Peter and John, etc. So that's explanation. And then consummation would be his word for the book of Revelation. So I love the way he's got that. It's like the Old Testament is like when you're on the J2J trail and the little kids are running along going, he's coming, and the Gospels are, he's here, right? He's here. I mean, maybe we should, throw a whole bunch of kids around. He's here. I guess there is one kid at the stable, right? Mm-hmm. He's here. So that's the same type of thing. The New Testament and the Old Testament combined are really the chronicle of God's work to renew his creation. That's what he's doing. That's what he promised to do at the fall. And they are the summation of God renewing his creation. And one of the things that I think is important for you as you read the Gospels is to see Jesus at work doing that. That's what he's always doing. You're like, I didn't see Jesus renewing anything. What do you think healing is? It's Jesus taking an effect of the fall and undoing it, renewing something. The paralytic man, he can't walk. And, what is that a result of? Adam and Eve disobeying God, right? And Jesus undoes that. He renews that man's strength. You see the apostles doing some of that in the book of Acts. It's all about God's work of bringing about renewal for his creation, and ultimately the new heavens and the new earth, right? So look for the ways in which Jesus demonstrates his power to do this, because we're resting on the promise that God is going to do this. And so Jesus has to be able to do this, and he does, all over the place. The New Testament has 27 books. 5 are considered historical books, the 4 Gospels and Acts. 21 are letters, and 1 is prophetical. The Gospels present the life and ministry of Jesus from unique perspectives. 4 unique perspectives. 4 different authors writing to 4 different audiences. Now that's what we think. We think that because as we look at them, we see differences in them, and so we believe that's the case. They didn't actually state that. Mark didn't say, "Hey, I'm writing to a Roman audience." Matthew didn't say, "I'm writing to a Jewish audience," but the clues within the book of Matthew point that he was writing to a primarily Jewish audience. So 4 different authors, 4 different perspectives, and in some ways 4 different purposes, but all aimed at lifting up Jesus as the exalted Son of God. Their purposes were to highlight different aspects of Jesus and his ministry, his life on earth. Most of what I'll share with you tonight is adapted from Wilkinson and Boas Talk Through the Bible. I mean, if you want to really read these things, you're like, I've read the introductions in the study Bible, and MacArthur follows some of this material that I'm going to share with you tonight very closely. I've read those introductions. I want to read more. I've got a million New Testament. Okay, a million's an exaggeration. But hey, Jesus exaggerated, right? He was like, chop off your hand. That's hyperbole. You're like, Jesus, did he just say exaggerate? No, hyperbole. I'm sorry. So I'm using hyperbole as well. I don't have a million, but I have way too many New Testament surveys and introductions. If you just want to go really dive in really deep, come see me, and I can help you with that. I've even got Boa and Wilkinson's book somewhere. This I have with my Bible software, Logos. Okay, so these four Gospels comprise about 46% of the New Testament. So they're almost half of the New Testament is taken up with the Gospels. What's really interesting is when we get to Luke, we can see that Luke, when you combine Luke and Acts, Luke actually had more influence on the New Testament in terms of writing than Paul, in terms of words, right? Now, we would say, well, yeah, but Luke was influenced by Paul, and you would be right there. So Paul's really got his fingerprints all over about half of the New Testament. But the Gospels make up 46% of the New Testament. And they're demonstrating for us the fulfillment of God's promise to send the Messiah. The word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news, glad tidings. We have kind of Anglo-Saxonized it from a Godspell. Gospel comes from that. But it means the good news about Jesus Christ, the good news that God was faithful to what he said he would do, and he'd accomplished in Jesus. There is no comparable Hellenistic literary form for the Gospels, meaning they are unique in the way they have been composed and the way, we can't look at them and say, oh, this is a prophetic form. You can see it in different types of religious writings. Throughout the Near Eastern world, people understand how to look at that. The Gospels were fairly unique. They are not biographies, like you might think of a biography of George Mueller or some other famous Christian from time. They are not biographies. They don't focus in on the entire picture of Jesus and try to really detail out each segment of his life. In fact, over half of their time is spent on the last few days of Jesus. Okay? John spends most of his time on those, about half of his gospel on the last few days of Jesus. They're more likely, I think you could say they're closer to like a memoir. These are the record of just kind of the thoughts, the teachings of the apostles as they went out and spread the good news of Jesus. But mostly they focus on like the last 50 or so days of Jesus' teaching. All right, here I'm going to give you some rough dates. Mark is primarily believed, to be the first gospel written. Who is Mark? John Mark. Through my glasses, I can't see you guys because they're all blurry. But I heard it, I thought it might be Judy, but it was John because it was so. John Mark is famous for what?
Leaving Paul.
Abandoning Paul and Barnabas, right? And Barnabas is John Mark's cousin. And John Mark was believed to have been, to have been with Peter throughout most of Peter's ministry. So Mark is considered really the reflections of Peter as he went and taught about Jesus. As he preached, as he ministered to people and shared, Mark collected the writings of Peter and published them in his gospel. The other two gospels that are in this family called synoptic gospels are Matthew and Luke. Matthew is believed to have been written before Luke, but that's debatable. They overlap a little bit in terms of the dates of their writing, but Mark would be the very first one, and then Matthew and Luke are believed to have used Mark and other sources. Luke says he used a lot of sources. He talked to people. He read things. Luke was a historian, an amateur historian. and he did an excellent job of researching. So there could have been other written documents out there. There was certainly a lot of oral teaching going around at this time. But it's Mark, and then Luke and Matthew written, and then John written much later, probably about 20 years later than the first three Gospels. In terms of their the uniqueness of each, Mark is only 7% unique, meaning Mark shares 93% of what he says with Matthew and Luke and John. 93%. But that's because he's written first, right? And they're drawing from Mark. Mark is the one that's really being passed around here, and they're drawing from that. Matthew is about 42% unique. Luke is 59% unique, and John is 92% unique. That just means that as they were writing to their different audiences and with different purposes, that they chose material in order to communicate something very specifically about Jesus. It shouldn't scare you that they are unique. It should actually give you, you should be very grateful to God that he looked at Jesus from 4 different points of view. But also, as you read these Gospels, don't feel that you need to come up with they used to publish these, I think they still do, harmonies of the Gospel, and you need to harmonize all the stories, and you need to figure out Luke says this differently than Matthew, who says this a little bit differently than Mark. So who got it right here? It's right. Okay? It's right. You don't have to harmonize everything for this reason. The way these letters were written, or these books were written in the first century, is different than the way we write today. We would expect exact quotation. Right? Exact quotation. Meaning if Mark said Jesus said this, then Matthew's going to say exactly the same thing, and Luke's going to say exactly the same thing. Because if those 3 reporters are sitting in the room, they better have their tape recorders on, and they better be quoting exactly. That would not have entered their minds as they wrote. They were not concerned with that. In fact, much of what they said or wrote was translation. Jesus probably did not go around teaching in Greek. He probably went around teaching in Aramaic, and they had to translate. And if you look at these, let's see, I have 3 different versions of the Bible represented here. They are all going to say the same thing, but sometimes they're going to say it with different words in a different way. But they're going to say the same thing. They're going to be, I believe, all 3 of these are in complete agreement with each other regarding what they are teaching as the Word of God. And the same is true for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If they've neglected to mention a certain detail, it's because as a writer, it did not serve their purpose. And ultimately, it didn't serve whose purpose? God's purpose, right? The Holy Spirit is leading them to write the way he is leading them to write. And he's doing that using the conventions of the day. Like, he's not going to turn them into 21st century reporters just so he can get this first century thing down. No, he takes a first century point of view and he records his perfect word. So as you read through here and you see details of stories that are just a little bit different, or you see words that might not be exactly the same, just ask yourself, is the story saying the same thing, teaching something similar? And then ask yourself, if it seems to be teaching something just mildly different, how is the author using it? Meaning, read what comes before and what comes after it again, and ask yourself, okay, what is the theme here, the web that Matthew is trying to create by linking these stories together? Because another one of the things that drives people crazy in reading these books is the chronology is not always identical. Meaning, stuff that comes in Mark and Matthew and Luke are not always arranged in the same order. It would have never entered their mind that they needed to do that. That was something in the first century that would have been perfectly acceptable within literature, within writing, within recording. Never entered their mind. What was important to them is that they sequenced things right? They sequenced things to paint the picture that they needed to paint of Jesus. Now you're like, man, this is causing my brain to explode and for me to really doubt the Bible. Don't. Because a couple of stories are out of order doesn't mean they didn't happen, and it doesn't matter where they happened or when they happened in the ministry of Jesus. In fact, we can't know for certain where any of these things happened other than the last few days of Jesus' life. Because we know where he is, we know what's happening in terms of the feast that's happening there, that's coming up, and on specific days what he is doing, and so we know that these things are happening in order. But if Jesus doesn't tell a certain story in this place in Mark and then also this place in Luke, that doesn't matter, and it shouldn't bother you, because God has always used the conventions of his day to record his word, and what was acceptable then has got to be acceptable to us. Okay? Does that make sense? Does anybody have a question about that?
I just think people look at, the way I used to look at it is the Gospels as biographies, and that's why from a biography you expect them to line up,
Right.
Because you're reading it as a biography instead of reading it as more like a memoir of what point are they trying to get across.
Yeah.
And stuff. So.
And understanding it's 2,000 years. I mean, we write differently today than the people did in the era of the founding fathers. I mean, if you've ever read a modern Christian book, and then as Brian likes to pitch you a Puritan book, and you pick it up and you're like, who can read this stuff? Right? I mean, these guys will just go on and on and on and on and on and on and on. I mean, I think Brian's getting too much Puritan influence. That's why he spends so much time on one word, just like he's turning into a Puritan right before our eyes. There could be worse things.
Can you ask for his money back?
Can you expand on you talked about him preaching in Aramaic.
Uh-huh.
All the disciples, they all spoke Aramaic. Is that a given, or is that not a given?
I mean, I would say, okay, the understanding is, did like Luke speak Aramaic? Maybe. Some people think he might have been a Hellenistic Jew, but there's a really strong biblical argument that he was Greek. Right? So he may have not spoken Aramaic, but Mark probably did. Matthew certainly did, and John certainly did. So they would have understood this, and these things were being translated from Aramaic into Greek as soon as the gospel starts to spread, because you can't go start telling Jesus sayings in Aramaic in different parts of the world. We're like, what is that? That's why Greek is the common language, right? So, and there have been people who said, well, because Jesus gave these sermons in Aramaic, then there are probably gospels. Maybe these gospels were originally written in Aramaic. That idea has been debunked. That's not something that's widely held any longer. That these are not translations of Aramaic versions of the gospels. That all four of these men understood that for these writings to be dispersed widely, they had to be written in Greek. And that was, they all understood the Great Commission, the gospel to the ends of the world. And you can't do that if you don't write in Greek in the first century. So, good question, though. All right, anything else? I've got 15 minutes now to get through 4. I kind of got long-winded there, but I've taught hermeneutics a few times, and I think that understanding of those little details being off kind of throws people. And liberal scholars will manipulate you by saying, well, look, these details don't line up exactly, when they know good and well that they didn't need to in the first century. But they won't tell you that. They'll prey upon your 21st century understanding like, well, if two witnesses disagree, one of them's telling the truth and one of them's not telling the truth. And so if we've got books of the Bible that don't agree, then we've got an errant Bible. And if we've got an errant Bible, we should all go home and watch football right now, right? That's what I think. But we don't have an errant Bible. We have to interpret the Bible in light of the culture in which it was written, and then understand it and apply it in our own day. All right, Matthew. Who is What's another name for Matthew in the Gospels? Levi. He was the tax collector from Matthew chapter 9, right? He's sitting around there in his booth, and Jesus says, "Come follow me," and he was more than happy to stop doing what he was doing, which tells me that Levi carried around a ton of guilt, right? He was probably persecuted quite a bit for what he was doing. He carried around a lot of guilt, and he was more than happy to follow this rabbi. And what a wonderful, I mean, think about that. What a privilege for this guy that the masses hated. And the King of Kings came up to him and said, "Hey, follow me. You're going to be one of my closest disciples, the 12. I mean, what a great privilege. No wonder he dumped all that stuff and ran to follow Jesus. In Mark, we find out that he is the son of Alphaeus. The setting, or the date of his book could be between 58 AD and 68 AD. Again, these are rough dates. We don't know exactly when these books appeared on the scene, but we do believe that is a fairly good window for when Matthew could have been written. The context for Matthew is that it's written by a Jew, to Jews about a Jew. I like the way Wilkinson and Bowen say that. It's very Jewish in its flavor. And its theme and purpose is to point to Jesus. And okay, if I say it's very Jewish, it's to point to Jesus as the promised what? Messiah. One more word. King. Thank you. Messianic king. We say that when we talk to David, right? We say something about Jesus not only being the son of Abraham, he would be the son of David, the king in the line of David. And that's what Matthew wants to point out here, is that this God-man was in the line of Abraham, so he's thoroughly Jewish, but he's not just Jewish, he is the rightful heir to the Davidic throne. And he does this by referencing several prophetic fulfillments of the life of and through the life of Jesus. And so he quotes from the Old Testament prophets all the time. And some of them are difficult to understand because we're 2,000 years removed, and we don't write the way Matthew is writing and using those prophecies the way Matthew is using them. We would really have to go back and study in context and in great detail those prophecies to understand why he's taking a snippet and saying, hey, this says this. When you read it, it's like, man, is that really what that was originally saying? Well, for the Jewish mind, taking that snippet meant they had the context of like 2 or 3 chapters worth of material surrounding it, floating around in their heads. Because unlike us, they knew a lot of this by memory. They didn't know all of it. Very few of them probably knew all of it. But even the average person knew a lot of the Old Testament by memory. And so quoting a very small piece gave them extreme context. But Matthew was prolific at demonstrating that Jesus was the promised Messianic king. So after 400 years of silence, Jesus pops on the scene. If you want a summary phrase for Matthew, it is that, Jesus, the promised king. If you're looking for some of the most important chapters in Matthew, you're like, they're all important. Yeah, they are all important. But there's a couple that will stick out in Matthew. One would be Matthew 16. Matthew 16. Anybody got an idea of what is contained within Matthew 16? Gotta say it loud if you know.
Sermon on the Mount.
Okay, Sermon on the Mount is 5 through 7. This is Peter's statement that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, on this rock I will build my church. Matthew 16 through 19. And then, of course, the Great Commission in Matthew 28. If you're just looking for a couple of key chapters, those are very key chapters. The most famous portion of Matthew's gospel would be, as John just said, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 through 7. Some call that the kingdom lifestyle. And maybe that's what life will be like in the Messianic kingdom, living according to those teachings of Jesus. Not sure about that. Jesus can do whatever he wants when he comes and sets up his kingdom, right? He can take the whole Old Testament and reinstitute it if he wants to. He can do whatever he wants. When he sits on the throne, it's going to be all him all the time, and we will hang on his every word. A key chapter outside of chapters 5 through 7 might also be chapter 12, which seems to be a turning point in Jesus' ministry. He's kind of presented, or the way Matthew presents him, is that he came straight forward to the people, began to teach, trying to demonstrate who he was, and at the rejection of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, the leaders of the nation, Jesus then began to speak in parables. And he began to explain those parables to his disciples. But he had his ministry kind of shifts there at Matthew chapter 12. The idea of Jesus as the promised Messianic King is seen right from the beginning. I mean, if you're familiar with how Matthew starts off, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So right there, Jesus is king. And then he goes on to reinforce this over and over, this idea of not only his humanity and being related to David, but then the idea that he is the Son of God, because that's kind of where Matthew is going with this genealogy. Jesus is described in Matthew chapter 2, verse 2, saying by the the wise men. Thank you. Man, that was an old person moment right there, wasn't it? I'm 50 now. I can have those. Man, it was like right there, and I'm like, I can't say wise men. Why not? Because my brain doesn't work anymore. I know some of you are like, hey, I'm older than you. That's really insulting. No, I'm just identifying. Let's embrace our age. All right, who is this who's been born King of the Jews? They said in Matthew 2, right? In chapter 3, verse 17, God says this. So we've got this idea of Son of David, King of the Jews, and then right away at Jesus' baptism, God speaks and says, this is my beloved Son. And instantly, we have a uniting of the humanity, the connection to David, and the deity of the connection to God. And then Matthew will continue to highlight that with references to Jesus being the Son of God, and really ending, I guess, on a high note at Jesus' crucifixion with a reference to Jesus as the Son of God. If I can find it here. Or not the Son of God. Oh, I'm thinking of Luke, aren't I? Or Mark. The centurion. Who says, surely this was the Son of God. Right? Man. Either that or I'm looking right at it and I can't find it. Verse 11. Oh, that's King of the Jews. No, can't see it. Well, anyway. You believe me. Humanity, deity, Son of David, Son of God. Jesus is it. Jesus is it. But Matthew didn't, as he wrote to Jews, he was very intentional in also highlighting that there were Gentiles that Jesus reached out to. There were Gentiles that were touched by Jesus' ministry. There are Gentiles in his genealogy who, you might say, well, they were converts eventually to Judaism. True, but they were Gentiles. Gentiles are shown worshiping him after his birth. The Magi are the ones, they're these pagan Gentiles have come to worship the king, and Herod's trying to kill him, and everybody else just ignoring him. Right? There are Gentiles. The Great Commission, as Matthew says, we go to all the nations. So it's written by a Jew, to Jews, about a Jew, but Matthew has a message. He's bringing, like Brian talked about, the unity of the church today. The church, at this point in time, when this is being written, the church is going through those growing pains of Jew and Gentile coming together, and Matthew has taken the time to show that, hey, Jesus was all about bringing us all under his kingship. His kingship. All right, Matthew's gospel also contains about 60% of his gospel contains the teachings by Jesus. So it is heavily loaded with teaching material, which is different from, say, Mark, and a little less so with Luke. Any questions about Matthew? Anything you'd like? If I know it, I can tell you. If Brian knows it, he could pitch in too, or if somebody else in the class knows it, they could pitch in. But any questions about Matthew?
It was there.
What's that?
It was in Matthew.
Century.
It was. Okay.
27, 54.
54. Why did I have 11 written down there? Man, I was looking at that going, I mean, I think I wrote 11 because I was looking at where they said, where the governor Pilate asked him, "Are you king of the Jews?" And that's in verse 11. I was like, oh yeah, 54. Yeah, truly this was the Son of God. So it starts with Son of David, ends with Son of God. Thank you, Judy. All right, Mark. Let's move on to Mark here. Mark highlights Jesus as the suffering servant, or the sacrificial servant, you might hear it said. Mark is writing, we believe, primarily to a Roman audience. He excludes a lot of Jewish customs and things, and he is writing very simply because Romans, that was more Roman in culture and nature, so that's why people believe that's the case. Again, God's intent is that these things go worldwide, so Mark, even though he didn't know it, was writing to Hindus, he was writing to Americans, he was writing to all of us, right? But it seems to be very, very centered on reaching the Roman mind and Roman understanding and stripping away kind of some of those things that might detract from that. I think one of the key verses for Mark has got to be Mark 10:45, right? The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So Jesus is portrayed as this suffering servant or sacrificial servant throughout Mark. We already discussed who Mark is related to and who his influence was. And, you know, just like, I can't remember which of the guys had this portion, I believe it was Joshua, you know, that Mark eventually became useful to Paul for ministry. That I think that was a tough lesson that Paul had to learn, that he gave up too early on a young man who just needed some more time. And I think that's really neat that God for the ages recorded that with Paul, those two had been reconciled, and Paul saw Mark as valuable. I think that's really, really awesome. Mark, the dating for Mark is somewhere between 55 AD and 65 AD, so not a lot of time difference from maybe, you know, if Mark was written in 55 and Matthew was written in 58, that's happening pretty quickly. You know, so Matthew's got to get a copy of Mark's gospel, and then he's using it to record his gospel. But those are the understood dates there for Mark, generally understood. Of course, you'll find people who say it was written in the 2nd century, but that's a bunch of baloney. Don't buy into that. We have enough manuscript evidence to demonstrate, especially in John being one of the worst. I didn't write this down, so I won't think about it, but it used to be that John was categorically, with the theology of John and the writing style of John and what John seemed to be attempting to accomplish, they were saying this had to be written in the late 2nd century or later than that. And then we find a fragment of John 8 that we can date back to 135 AD, and it was in Egypt, which means it had taken a long time to travel there, right? And so, yeah, that sets everybody back on their heels, right? Like, oh, we debunked that book of John, and now, probably was written in the early 1st century, you know? Or late 1st century. I love that. Sorry, I'm kind of off on it. I just love it when, I mean, as a former atheist, I understand that mindset that's like, man, got to relieve people of this religious craziness that they're involved in. And I love it when God takes the foolishness of the world and really makes them look foolish. And then he takes the foolishness of Christ and makes it look like God's a genius, right? Just like he did to Satan. It's like, oh, kill my son. Oh, you lose. You know? I mean, that's so awesome, right? You lose. I'm getting ready to go on a big tangent here. I just love that idea that Satan had no idea that killing Jesus was the biggest mistake he would ever make. Well, why inhabit Judas and send him out if you do, right? No idea. He couldn't get it. Why? Because those things are spiritually discerned. And to the natural man or the sinful, evil creature of Satan, just couldn't grasp it. Love it. All right, got to move quicker here. So Jesus as the suffering servant. Key verses might be John 10, as we said, verses 43 through 45, or John chapter 8. Mark, I'm sorry. Mark chapter 8, 34 through 37. That's where Jesus is talking about taking up your cross, denying yourself. It's one of the clearest calls to discipleship and what that's going to mean. Mark 8 is seen as kind of like the Matthew 12. It's kind of the hinge chapter where the book begins to take a turn and Jesus begins to spend more time pouring into his followers and his disciples and calling people or explaining his eventual suffering and death and how difficult it's going to be. Jesus is presented in Mark as really, as this suffering servant, he's one of the more, Mark and Luke are the more human emphasis of Jesus, meaning you see Jesus being compassionate, you see Jesus doing things and healing people, in contrast to the objections of a people who were stuck in their rigid traditions. And so you see the humanity of Jesus really fleshed out in the book of Mark, but you also, and Mark highlights this very specifically, the authority and the power of Jesus over everything. So again, here is God demonstrating, I'm about renewing this whole deal. This thing is not stuck in a downward spiral forever. I promise to renew. I will renew. Oh, look, here's Jesus. He's just out there. Everything he's touching is renewed. He's renewing hearts. He's renewing lives. He's renewing legs. He's renewing eyes. He's just doing it all. And he's in Mark. And he's doing it with compassion and love. And he's not afraid of anyone or anything. All right, Mark is a very quick-paced book, so as you read it, you'll see that. He uses the word immediately, so he's moving the story along. He ends one account, and he says, now immediately Jesus, and it doesn't mean like, Jesus left this thing and immediately was in this place, and he drug his disciples with him, and that's Mark's way of moving the book along. He is more vivid in his descriptions of certain events than Matthew and Luke are. They had tended to leave out some of those details, didn't serve their purposes much. Mark was much more detailed. Maybe that was just Peter. Peter was one of the inner three, right? Peter, James, and John, they were the inner three with Jesus. I don't know if that offends you, that Jesus had some really close friends, and then he had one disciple whom he loved. He had a super close friend. Can you imagine that? The Son of God playing favorites? He wasn't playing favorites. He's just like, he was a man. He was like you and me. He had a close friend that he left his mother with. That's a close friend. And Peter was in that circle. And so the stories that he told about Jesus to Mark were full of vivid detail. And of course, Peter would know. Peter is seen in Mark very clearly as Peter, right? Very clearly as Peter. So Peter didn't hide anything either from Mark. Mark is a wonderful contribution to the Synoptic Gospels. All right, Luke. Man, I got to move fast. The perfect man. Jesus is seen as the perfect man in Luke. Luke is a book that is carefully documented, written as one of a two-part series to Theophilus. Right? We don't know a lot about Theophilus. I know there's a lot of trying to figure out who this guy is and why Luke is writing. Was he a believer, or was he somebody investigating about becoming a believer? We're not 100% certain on that, but we do know that he was very interested in Jesus Christ, and it could be that God was using Luke to draw him to faith, not just because he had faith, but drawing him to faith through Luke in his research and his writing. As we said before, Luke spent a lot of time with Paul, so these would probably represent a lot of Pauline teachings, but not only Pauline teachings. We've got Peter's teachings through Luke's familiarity with Mark, and we've got the other things that Luke's interviews with people and the other documents that Luke would be using to come up with his gospel. Luke tends to say Aramaic words and then translate them into Greek for his readers. So he, even though he's writing primarily to Greeks, he might be writing to some Hellenistic Jews as well, who would be familiar maybe with some of the Aramaic, and he's kind of helping them along understand this story. He clearly states his purpose. He's trying to give an orderly account of Jesus' life and ministry. His key verses might be in chapter 1, verses 3 to 4, where it says, "It seemed good to me, having had perfect understanding of all these things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed." He's like, I want you to be certain about these things that you have heard. You can be certain that Jesus is the Christ. And chapter 19, verse 10, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost." Right? The Son of Man has come to seek and to save the lost. Let's see here. Again, Luke is very focused on the humanity of Jesus. As a doctor, he took great interest in the way it appears, the way that as he heard stories and read stories, that Jesus interacted with human beings. Some of this story, as we said, there are many unique things in Luke. 59% of Luke being unique. He had some unique accounts that were very important to him, demonstrating Jesus as the perfect God-man, but focusing on his humanity. He wanted Jesus to be seen as human, not just God that can't be related to. He wanted to draw Jesus' identification with humanity out in his gospel and to communicate it very clearly to the Greeks, because the Greeks' concepts of God as so disconnected from their people and so cruel to their people. I think for Luke, it was important for him to show, no, God was down in the trenches with his people. He was weeping with his people. He was serving his people and ministering to his people and dying for his people because he loved his people. And Luke does an excellent job of demonstrating that Jesus. And that lines up well with the Jesus that Paul taught, right? All right, any questions about Luke? I know I flew through that because I got to get through John in 2.5 minutes.
Did you say a date for Luke's writing?
Oh, did I? Luke's writing is going to be very similar to Matthew. Let's see. Where was that? I did not say the date for. I didn't even write it down. I believe it's like in the late 50s, no, early 60s to late or early 70s. I don't like the idea of early 70s. I think that's a little too late because of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. It's probably more likely that Luke was written sometime before that, so it could have been very late in the 60s. The question is, did Luke write this before the death of Paul or after the death of Paul? And I think he did it after the death of Paul because he was too busy with Paul. Right? He was with Paul. You're like, well, he could have been writing while he was with Paul. Well, I just get the sense that this is something that Luke took on after Paul's ministry and his time with Paul, supporting Paul, being with Paul even at the end there. So I think it's probably in that late early 60s to right before 70. But to me, it's not written after 70 AD. Would you agree with that, Brian?
Yes.
Okay. Good. All right. John is the most unique of them. Jesus is displayed here in his two natures, but John is highlighting that he is the Son of God. It's thought that John is combating some different theological challenges that he's facing as he's writing this gospel a little bit later than some of these other gospels. It's probably written the range is about 30 years, anywhere from 60 to 90, but I think most people are saying John is written even after the destruction of the temple. It's written much later than the other Gospels. He doesn't get into specifically, like we might expect, hitting on the destruction of the temple and that type of thing, but he does. But his writing is so developed, and that's what confused people and made them think, man, this must be like 2nd, 3rd century writing. It is so developed, and yet we know it was so very early. Well, that makes a lot of sense because John spent a lot of time with Jesus, and John lived the longest of the apostles. He spent a lot of time in Ephesus. He spent a lot of time in captivity on Patmos, and he had a lot of time to develop his teaching around Jesus. He probably read Paul just like Peter and was learning things that were being revealed to Paul. And so we expect John to be much more theologically developed, being written so much later. It appears that he relied on a lot different information. He was a first-hand eyewitness. You see that all over the place. We got a lot of verses here that Bo and Wilkinson record. I won't go into all of them, but he is an eyewitness at the death of Jesus. He's an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus, right? Peter and John running to the tomb to see Jesus. I mean, John was on hand, and he is not referred to in this gospel in any other way than the disciple whom Jesus loved. And when you think about that, I mean, our natural 21st century inclination would be to think, man, that's a really arrogant way to refer to yourself. I'm the guy that Jesus loved. I think it demonstrates more of a humility than we might be tempted to think, in the sense of like, my name's not important, just know this, Jesus loves me. I don't think John could believe that Jesus could love a son of thunder. Jesus, this gentle, meek, loving man, loved a guy who was filled with anger and just frustration. He did. And he became his best friend, the one that he entrusted his mother to. I mean, I think that was humbling and overwhelming for John. Not arrogance to say, I'm the disciple Jesus loved. Peter, forget about Peter. No, humble and so filled with awe at Jesus. Of course, the Word, Jesus was the Word. John is the one that most clearly demonstrates Jesus' deity. As you read through John, look for the 7 signs of Jesus, the 7 main signs: turning the water into wine, healing the official's son, healing the paralytic in John chapter 5, feeding the 5,000 in John chapter 6, walking on water in John chapter 6, healing the blind man in John chapter 9, and raising Lazarus in John chapter 11. These signs were to point to Jesus as the Son of God, the Christ, the Son of the living God. And there were also the 7 I am statements. John does not write about the parables of Jesus, but he uses these. Some have called these allegory. I don't really like the term allegory in reference to the I am statements, but I am the good shepherd. I am the bread. I am the vine. I am the water, the living water, right? These are the Jesus saying, this is who I am. And there are 7 of those as well. So look for those as you read. John is very selective and topical and theological in his writings. He exalts the deity of Christ, but he also highlights the humanity of Jesus as well. He doesn't just make him, it hasn't turned from, hey, let's highlight God being with his people. He doesn't turn away from that, because we see Jesus interacting with his people. But he wants to combat some teaching that is now kind of gotten lopsided and is focused more on the humanity of Jesus than the deity of Jesus. He's like, Jesus, my purpose is to teach you, what does he say? That Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that you might believe in his name through this gospel, through this teaching, that you might understand who he truly is. Because if you see Jesus is just a man, then he can't die for your sins, right? He can't do what he came to do, and the Father sent him with a purpose. Of course, the key chapter in John is going to be what? Probably the most preached.
Chapter 4.
3. Very close. I mean, John 4 with the woman at the well is, yes. But John 3:16, I mean, what? Used to be in Eldenfeld stadiums every Sunday, right? I mean, how wild is that? How far have we come? Long ways. John chapter 3 being one of the most important chapters as Jesus kind of reveals himself to Nicodemus and says some really incredible things about why he came and what he came to do and how important belief in him was. That without belief, there's condemnation. And John does the best job, and you'll see this if anybody's ever talked to you about reading through John. They ask you to look for the words that revolve around belief and faith, but also look for expressions of unbelief, even in those who are said to believe. Right? So it says, hey, this group believed, and then it says, oh, but Jesus knew their hearts. So you can see the difference between actually getting something, getting some head knowledge, but it not really connecting and becoming true faith. All right, any question about John? I'm sorry I shortchanged John there for that introduction. I think you guys are going to love reading through the Gospels. Like I said, I have resources if you get through them and you're like, I'd really like to read more about them in detail and some of the scholarship that's been given to the research of these. Come see me. I've got lots of books. You are free to check them out and read them if you want to. But get a good study Bible. Do we sell this in our bookstore?
They sell the King James version.
What?
Yeah. They have the other one though.
They have the ESV.
ESV.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'm not saying the King James version is bad, but you need a modern version, in my opinion.
I don't know about the NLT, but they have the other one, the ESV.
Yeah, I knew they had the ESV. I couldn't remember. I know we have MacArthur's commentaries and some other things. All right, I got to let you go. I'm sure the youth are wanting to come in here, and I'm already supposed to be interviewing people. So.